Welcome back. We are joined today by Jiang Xueqin to discuss the developments between the United States and Iran. So thank you very much for coming back on.
Thanks, Glenn.
So well, the first thing I think about is in regards to this war is that the Iranian targets all seem to be very well calculated in terms of economics, and I think this is interesting because usually in all American wars, there's some economic interests to go to war. But now we see them, well, not just shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, but you see them when they essentially force the Americans to spend their expensive interceptor missiles. All of this seems to have an economic underpinning. But the really big thing appears to be the possible attack now on the petrodollar. I was wondering, how do you see the vulnerability of the petrodollar in this war?
Right. So I would argue that right now, this war in Iran, it's primarily about maintaining the petrodollar. Because these past 10 years, the world has become increasingly concerned about the viability of the petrodollar. Right now, the United States is $39 trillion in debt. The United States, right after the Russians invaded Ukraine, froze over $200 billion in Russian assets, which makes the world question the legitimacy as well as the credibility of the US financial system. Because if the Americans can weaponize the US dollar against the Russians, they can weaponize the US dollar against everyone. So after that, you saw this massive exodus from US treasuries. And right now, China is establishing the gold corridor. So BRICS is trying to create alternatives to the petrodollar. But for the Americans, the petrodollar is the very basis of their empire. And quite honestly, it's the it's the objective of their empire. So the United States right now is in a fight tooth and nail to protect the petrodollar. What this basically means is to use its naval supremacy, its control over strategic choke points, maritime choke points, to control trade access, and basically force nations to depend on US resources. So we saw that the United States in January attacked Venezuela, and now it's attacked Iran. Recently, these past few days, there was a Ukrainian drone strike on Russia's main export hub, which basically took off 40% of Russian oil from the global market. And so Europe and East Asia are now forced to depend on the United States, North America, for energy. And right now we're seeing a pivot from Europe and East Asia over to North America. And so that's a strategy in place where the United States basically wants to take off Russian GCZ oil and force the world to buy from the United States, which protects the petrodollar. But what we know from history is that this sort of hubris will lead to a backlash, and it will lead to the world unifying against America eventually. Because quite honestly, America used to be the policeman of the world, and that's become the pirate of the world. And so maybe in the short term, you will see the strategy working out, but definitely in the long term, you will see the world becoming much more aggravated by this piracy.
But beyond this, what Trump might be planning, a common argument is often that Trump is not necessarily fully in control, that he's, if not compromised, at least under great influence from various interests, be it the neocons or the Israelis. How do you see this, the extent of Trump's control? Because, given how different his second administration is compared to the first, one often gets the impression that it doesn't always matter who, sits on the throne in the US.
I think in the first administration, there was a lot of concern within the deep state and the neocons and the different political factions were in Washington, D.C. about Trump's capacity to be a leader because he was outrageous in his speech and his rhetoric. The Europeans were very much concerned about Trump. Trump started this trade war with China that was hurting the global economy, and it was hurting American consumers. Trump did not seem like a viable leader, and he did not seem as though he could maintain the empire. And people felt that if he stayed in office longer, the Europeans would drift away, China would drift away, the entire world would drift away, and American hegemony would die. But then what happened, of course, was that Biden came to power. And Biden was essentially comatose. He did nothing for 4 years. So Putin invaded Ukraine, and Americans didn't really have a forceful response. I mean, they did do a lot of things like blow up the Nord Stream pipeline. They sanctioned Russian energy. They removed Russia from the SWIFT system. They froze $200 billion in Russian assets. They did a lot of things, but none of these things were actually useful. And the empire decided that regardless of what we feel about Trump, he is forceful. He will act. Whereas Biden and the Democrats may not act because essentially they're a bunch of pussies. And so the decision was made to reinstate Trump in 2024. And that's why we are here today. So Trump is an agent of empire. He is doing what the empire requires. Okay. And so what happened before during the Napoleon moment, basically from 1991 up to today, was that America had a lot of goodwill and it was able to achieve the consent of the world, mainly by co-opting the global elite, right? So all these elites in Europe, in Russia, in China, they were mainly concerned about engaging as much corruption as possible so that they can basically transfer their ill-gotten gains into America. And this system worked really well for the elite for a long, long time. But obviously, these nation states were not very happy with the state of affairs. That's why you saw the rise of Putin in Russia and the rise of Xi in China, because there was a lot of concern among the nationalists that America was hollowing out these countries, and they were completely right in the matter. So now you're seeing a direct challenge to American empire. And so the only challenge is you don't have the consent of these nation states, then you must use force to enforce your empire within these nation states. And so before the American military was used in order to guarantee peace in the Pax Americana, it was used to guarantee international trade. They were the policemen of the world in order to maintain the rules-based national order. And now that Russia and China and other nations are questioning the legitimacy of the rules-based national order, what Trump is doing is he is transforming the American military, from a police force into a pirate force in order to extract tolls from the world. So we are in this situation because Trump's first strategy was to use tariffs on the world, right? To force the Europeans to pay tariffs to the American empire. But the Supreme Court struck that down because they said that the executive branch does not have the authority to enforce tariffs. Only Congress does. So Trump's like, well, you know what? If you won't let me enforce tariffs, then I'll just enforce tolls, okay? I'll make the world pay tolls in order to have trade around the world. And that's why we're seeing the Americans deploy one-third of their Navy into the Caribbean to block trade into the Western Hemisphere. That's why we're seeing this war in Iran to block off the world from Middle East energy. And that's why we're seeing right now the U.S. Navy basically boarding Russian shadow fleet tankers, basically stealing shadow fleet tankers. And we'll see more of this as the months go by.
Yeah, what's interesting with Trump, though, there's some consistency here. I mean, many people, I guess, mistook his rhetoric for being, all about peace. But if you listen to what he said all the way going back to the 1980s, he was essentially scolding all the Japanese and others for taking advantage of the U.S. the way he saw it. So he didn't say that we shouldn't have a big empire. He just said the empire, they should pay us for the privilege of being protected. So it's not that they didn't want an empire. It seemed he just wanted a better return on investment. That is, you have to monetize the empire somehow. Otherwise, the empire will kill off the republic. So in other words, it should feed it. It looks as this is where his main difference is. But that means not just extracting from adversaries, but also allies. But I don't think it's limited to Trump. I think overall the United States will tilt more and more in this direction, because as they have, as you said, they exhausted themselves with $39 trillion in the hole. It's not as if you can vote for a Democrat and suddenly they go back to paying for the security of allies anymore and having generous trade agreements. There's no going back after, exhausted to this extent. Sorry.
Yeah, so this is a really important point that you make, okay? So remember, in 2016, when Trump first came into office, he was saying the same things you're saying, which is everyone's taking advantage of us, especially China. So let's impose tariffs and make sure that that it's America first, that America is winning in this trade relationship. But after Trump left office, Biden came in with the Democrats and they institutionalized his policies, okay? So in the first Trump administration, a lot of it was personal, especially his tariff war against China. And then Biden and the Democrats made it institutional. And so we can expect the same process here, where maybe Trump leaves office in 2028, the Republicans lose, the Democrats come into office, and they won't change anything. All they're going to do is institutionalize it and make it a long-term sustainable policy, because this is what benefits the American empire.
So how will the great powers respond then? Because the US obviously is shifting strategy. It's becoming more extractive and more aggressive. Again, it's not going down without a fight. How do you see the Chinese and the Russians reacting to this? You mentioned before that China's its gold corridor in terms of shifting more to gold instead of being reliant on the US dollar. But what is being the overall strategy here? Because my impression is, at least from the Russians, that they the interpretation that Trump was someone they could make peace with and reset relation, it appears to be backsliding. I think they were quite appalled by what has happened to Iran, not just the attack on economic infrastructure, but also the killing of its leaders. And it seems very much to go against their interest. And also Trump never actually did what he promised, which was to end the war in Ukraine. And in all fairness, this could have been done if he would have cut off the intelligence agencies still working there.
All right. So again, I think we give too much credit to Trump. I think that this is a natural response of empire to its decline. Historically, empires have never gone quietly into the night. They have flailed against the wind, and they have tried to destroy the world as they decline. And so we can see much more hubris. We will see much more thuggery and piracy from America with or without Trump. And so I think we're in a situation because of the limitations of Chinese strategic thinking. So when China built the Belt and Road Initiative, which was proper, which was a good strategy of trying to secure resource independence from the United States, the problem was that when these Chinese ships went to collect commodities from overseas, they were escorted by the U.S. Navy. When they came back, they were escorted by the U.S. Navy. It was the U.S. Navy that guaranteed the protection of Chinese trade. And it never occurred to Chinese policymakers that one day, one of these days, America could be like, why don't we just steal the cargo? Why are we escorting these Chinese ships around the world? Why can't we just steal it? And so it never really occurred to Chinese policymakers of this possibility. And I don't know why this is the case, but we can go into many possibilities. But the reality is that China is now in a lot of trouble, where China has invested $200 billion into the Middle East in infrastructure. China right now imports 50 to 6% of its oil needs from the Middle East. Now that the Strait of Hormuz has been closed off, now that this war is raging in the Middle East, China is in a lot of trouble. And again, this all has to do with the limitations of Chinese strategic thinking. And so now China is in a lot of trouble. And in the short term, China has absolutely no choice at all, but to agree to Trump's demands, which is that China will become a major purchaser of American LNG. China has absolutely no choice in the matter. Okay, absolutely no choice. There's something China can do. In the mid and long term, what's going to happen is that Russia will start to challenge America in the seas. It's going to challenge American maritime naval supremacy. Basically, what Russia's going to do is it's going to arm its shadow fleet. And there's no way that Russia could defeat America militarily in the seas. But America will be forced to fight a war of attrition. And over time, the American Navy will be downgraded. It will be degraded. And it'll be very hard for the American Navy to replenish its lost ships. And so that's what we're seeing in the long term. But in the short term, there's absolutely nothing Russia and China can do.
Yeah, I often think about the current situation. It resembles a little bit like before World War I. That is, you saw Germany building and becoming stronger and stronger in terms of industrial production, steel production, essentially all the key measurements. Meanwhile, the British controlled the seas. Their ability to actually compete against the British was was in the hands of the British. So all they had to do is begin to cut off or threaten their supply lines, which is why the Germans also had to find other possible corridors, either land or sea. But it's a little bit with the Chinese, I feel. They have all this, well, probably one of the motivations behind the Belt and Road Initiative, that is, you can't rival the US as the leading economy, while the Americans are then organizing their organizing their supply lines and their physical transportation corridors. It doesn't make much sense. But this return to piracy, as you say, or choking off these different transportation corridors. We've seen, of course, the blockade on Venezuela, Cuba, the hijacking of these Russian ships. By the way, the hijacking of Iranian tankers have happened for some years now before this war as well. So I get it that our hegemony in decline will begin to weaponize all the economic levers of power. That is access to its technologies and industries, transportation corridors, banks, currencies. All of this is weaponized. But the United States isn't all powerful either. I mean, what is the main challenge for the US to hold out? Because, as you said, they're struggling with their own debt. This is all their economic trouble is also translating into social and political instability. So it looks as if they can't afford to play this game with the Iranians for too long. At some point they will have to put an end to this thing.
I think that the goal is to have this war continue for as long as possible. And the reason why is that if there were peace in the Middle East, what would happen is that Russia, Iran, and China would get together and form a trade alliance to counter America's control over the seas. And this trade alliance could extend easily into Europe, into Africa. This is what McKenna calls the Heartland thesis, right? Where America and Britain, the way for them to maintain their empire is by controlling maritime navigation. And the great concern is that a power would emerge in Eurasia to unite the Heartland and basically negate Anglo-American naval power. And so this war in Iran cannot stop. If it stops, then Russia could achieve its north-south trade corridor, and China could implement its Belt and Road Initiative. And given how America is starting to behave, then I think that Europe, the Middle East, Africa would happily join this trade alliance and basically try to ignore the Western Hemisphere and Britain. And so there's no way that America will cede Iran and leave Iran alone. It's going to send in ground troops to create as much chaos as possible and try to disrupt the Belt and Road Initiative. So what we're seeing is that the Israelis and Americans are targeting railways in Iran, which is crucial to the Belt and Road Initiative. And so we can expect maybe mowing the lawn of Belt and Road infrastructure for years and years.
Yeah, I couldn't help but to notice the targeting of the railroads as well as some ports in the Caspian. So this entire international north-south transportation corridor which have been building from Russia, Iran to India, this is being undermined. But also, of course, Iran's connectivity with China. So, but I'm just wondering about the feasibility here, because what exactly can boots on the ground achieve, but also can the United States get the boots on the ground, because they're quite overextended already?
Right. So the boots on the ground, it's basically to maintain the war, right? So the problem with air warfare, which is what the Americans and Israelis have been using for the past 6 weeks, is that it's gonna be very hard to maintain your air power. We're already seeing some planes crashing because they're not well maintained. We're seeing the Iranians adapt very creatively and resiliently to American air power. So you can only establish air supremacy by having boots on the ground. And so I think the main objective of the boots on the ground is not necessarily to take over Iran. I mean, that's a suicide mission, but it's basically to secure the coastline and try to degrade Iran's air defenses and basically force Iran on the defensive. The main objective, I think, if I'm fighting this war, I think my main objective is to choke off Tehran, basically to cut off all railways, cut off all roads, and basically force the population into starvation.
So this is where you think we're going?
I think so.
Destroying the population, or as Trump would say, kill off a civilization?
That's right. That would be the strategy moving forward, yes, to basically besiege Tehran.
It's just such a big country. It seems hard to, again, if the railroads are undermined. But it also has its domestic problems, though, that Trump needs to, it's not a popular war among the public, and it has some fierce political opposition, only intensified with the political polarization. I do want to ask about NATO, though, because this is was often perplexing to many Europeans, because while in the Gulf states they're now discussing the extent to which being frontline states for the US is actually harmful to the security. They're having some of these talks in East Asia as well. But in Europe, I mean, they must be the most loyal, obedient allies or frontline states of the United States. I'm convinced they would have possibly joined the war on Iran if you would have asked them before it went south. But why does it seem to be such an objective for Trump to, I guess, undermine NATO? Because this is the main. I mean, the Europeans don't have much political imagination to have security without the United States. So, it looks like a massive resource to have the Europeans essentially buy whatever America wants to use their currency, buy their energy, buy their expensive weapons. I mean, the Europeans will do anything if they believe America will be there for them. So why make this big show out of, we're not going to be there for you anymore? Because if there's one thing that would make the Europeans break off and seek an independent path from the United States, it's essentially the US has to shut the door on them, because they're not, otherwise they wouldn't shut the door on America. So it's a bit strange how I can understand that NATO's not, that the Europeans, they're not really a force amplifier. They're not bringing much to the table. They're a bit of a cost, but still, it's a bit, strange how dismissive he is of them, though.
So I think that the real war is actually not between the United States and Iran. I mean, the real war is between the globalists and the nationalists, right? So in the United States, it'd be a war between the financial elite, as represented by the city of London and Wall Street, versus MAGA and America First. And so what Trump wants to do is basically transition America from an empire into something called a technate, which is the idea of a greater North America, right? So move away from the world and just focus on consolidating greater North America, taking over Canada, taking over Greenland, taking over Mexico, taking over Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, Honduras, Nicaragua. Okay, so these countries that Trump has been pissing off for the past few months. Okay, but the grand vision is to transition America into greater North America and become a continental fortress that sells resources to the rest of the world, because the rest of the world is at war and is in desperate need of both fertilizer and energy. And so Trump really sees NATO as part of the deep state, as part of the globalist class. And so he's using this war as a pretext to sever relations with NATO. Basically, Trump would be perfectly happy if NATO were to go into Ukraine and be absolutely massacred by the Russians. That would solve a major headache of his. So yes, there is this war going on between the United States and Iran, but we have to forget that we should not forget there's also a shadow war going on between the globalists and the nationalists in America. This is also why Washington, D.C. is supportive of Trump's war, because the globalists want Iran to be humbled. They want Iran to be destroyed so that they can extend the hegemony of the empire. And they think that Trump is a useful idiot, a puppet, in order to achieve this goal. And that's why the Democrats have not stopped him. You know, there was recently, 2 weeks ago, No Kings protests in the United States, millions of people. And like, you were allowed to say no kings, but you were not allowed to say no war, right? You would think like that people would be much more governized by an anti-war settlement than they are by like an anti-tyrant settlement. But during the protests, which were organized by Democratic lobby groups, which were very pro-Zionist, you were not allowed to voice any anti-war settlement. So it just goes to show you that all of Washington, D.C. is fully behind this war, and they think that Trump will be the scapegoat. That even if this war goes badly, Trump will be the one that takes all the blame. The Republicans will be wiped out in the midterms, and then Democrats can steamroll back in office in 2028. And then they can implement a globalist agenda and destroy MAGA once and for all.
Yeah, this language, though, the globalists versus the nationalists, it's fascinating that the first time I read about this divide was by Samuel Huntington, none other. Back in 2004, he wrote this article, Dead Souls, where he was making the point that all this globalization had essentially created a political elite detached from the nation. So he was making the prediction that the future divisions in the world would be between the cosmopolitans or globalists versus the nationalists or patriots. So I thought it was insightful. Again, it's 2004. Yeah, it's been 22 years. And if you listen to a lot of the new populist leaders we have, this is what they're, Marine Le Pen to AfD, this is essentially the same language they also use now. Let me just ask a last question, though. How does Russia fit into this? Because all the pieces kind of make sense. I understand the rivalry between the United States, China, the problem of Iran, but Russia is, it's an energy superpower in many ways. It doesn't have to be an opponent of the United States. It's within this rivalry between the cosmopolitans and the nationalists. It belongs to the latter, it seems. So how do you see this impacting the thinking in the United States? But it's a close partner to Iran and China should have had.
Right, yeah. So right now, the United States' main adversary is not China. It's really Russia. Because Russia is the only country that has the resources, the political will, and the territorial integrity in order to challenge American hegemony. And so right now, America's major concern is Russia. And this war against Iran is really seen as a way to counter Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Basically, once Russia went into Ukraine, America has actually no choice but to attack Iran in order to counter Russia's possible control over the Heartland. And so this is going to be the defining struggle for the world for the next 20 years, not between the United States and China, but between Russia and America. And the great question is, where will the world align over the next 20 years? If history is a guide, most countries will start to align with Russia. Because if you go back to the Peloponnesian War, the main aggressor was Athens. And what happened ultimately was that the entire world ultimately aligned against Athens because Athens was seen as the great aggressor. So right now, the great aggressor is America. And we can see that the world, especially Europe and Iran and China, turning to Russia as the great salvation. And what Russia will do is start to challenge America in the seas. Again, I don't think there's any hope that Russia will win against America in the seas. But Russia has absolutely no choice but to start to challenge America.
播报新闻是我的日常，必须时刻保持妆容和皮肤的最佳状态。当来到人生中最重要的时刻， 也是 KS 逆时奇迹帮助我轻松驾驭，闪闪发光。KS 逆时奇迹活肤露、全效精华、精华霜，多达5种 EGF 6大冻龄关键成分，保湿效果让我非常满意，小细纹也不再困扰我。我就是我自己的最佳女主角 ，KS 让我从容自信，光彩动人。我是我人生中的大女主，我的最爱我做主。KS 逆时奇迹系列热卖中，下单请上快点购，透过中天新闻网 App 下单立减50%，或输入 CTI 推荐码有额外折扣。